Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 205 and it's titled Tippy Tappies. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week our random card was suggested to us by Vintage over on Discord, and that card is Oracle en-Vec, and that is 1 and a white for a 1/1 wizard. I believe it's a human wizard now, and it can tap and target opponent chooses any number of creatures that they control. During that player's next turn, those creatures attack if able, and no other creatures can attack. At the end of that turn, destroy each of those creatures that did not attack. Use this ability only during your turn. So there's a lot happening with this card, but essentially it forces our opponents to decide if they're going to attack on their turn or not, and then if they choose to attack, any of the creatures that they've chosen, if for some reason they don't attack or can't attack, then they are destroyed at the end of turn. So it kind of plays like a weird combat control kind of card, and we wanted to try to find a way to make that work and also kind of shut down some of the ways that our opponents could attack. So with that in mind, our commanders for this week, because we do have two of them, are the partner pairing of Timin, Youthful Geist, and Rhoda, Geist Avenger. Timin is 4 and a blue for a 3/4 legendary creature spirit. It of course partners with Rhoda, Geist Avenger, has flying, and at the beginning of each combat, tap up to one target creature. Rhoda is 3 and a white for a 3/3 human soldier, partners with Timin, has vigilance, and whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, put a +1/+1 counter on Rhoda. So putting these two cards together in the command zone gives us the ability with Oracle en-Vec to essentially force our opponents to either not attack at all or choose things to attack, and then we can tap them down, meaning we can effectively destroy them for little to no value on our opponent's part and little to no cost on our part. So it plays as a bit of a, again, kind of a combat control style of deck where we want to control where our opponents are attacking, when they're attacking, and try to kind of politic our way to a victory. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of our themes for this deck and break down what exactly it is we're trying to do. So first up, we have Lost-Narc Captain representing our tap abilities. One of the big things we try to do with this deck is try to make sure that we always have a way to tap down our opponent's creatures, and preferably repeatable ways to tap them down. So we're not leaning heavily into the creatures that can tap themselves to tap another creature, but cards that kind of reward us for just playing the game. Lost-Narc Captain, in that sense, is 3 and a white for a 3/1 human soldier. She has first strike, and whenever she or another human enters the battlefield under your control, tap target creature an opponent controls. And at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So this is a repeatable way for us to tap a creature, but it's also a card that kind of just rewards us for playing the game. Humans are a very common creature type. One of our commanders, Rhoda, is a human. So being able to tap things down for just continuing to play the game is a great way that we can get out ahead of the rest of the board and kind of shut our opponents down. The other thing that we want to be doing with our deck and our second theme is going to be rewarding ourselves for our opponent's creatures becoming tapped. And a great example of that is Verity Circle, which is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, you may draw a card. Then we can also pay 4 and a blue to tap target creature without flying. We are most likely not going to be using that second ability, but it is nice to have just in case. What it's really here for is to reward us for activating things like Lost-Narc Captain or Timin. Anytime we tap down our opponent's creatures, we get to draw a card, and that is an incredibly powerful ability because that's just going to keep drawing us into more things that can tap more creatures, and then we draw more cards to keep tapping things, and we can really put ourselves in a situation where we are so far ahead of our opponents in terms of value that if they're trying to win with creatures, there's really not much they're going to be able to do. And then finally, we come to our last theme of the deck, and this one is going to be protecting ourselves. So there's a lot of different ways that you can protect yourselves in the Azorius colors, but we're really focusing on enchantments and spells that don't necessarily prevent straight up people from attacking us, but they really want to suggest that people attack other players. And a great example of that is Palatian Accord, which is 3 white-blue for an enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, put a shield counter on Palatian Accord, and then we can remove a shield counter from Palatian Accord and prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to you this turn. So if we are consistently tapping down our opponent's creatures, and you'll notice that this is just whenever they become tapped, so if they do attack us, it does still trigger the Accord, but as long as our opponent's creatures are still being tapped down, we will rack up a ton of shield counters and then be able to just remove them to prevent damage. So if our opponents make a million 1/1 tokens, it doesn't actually matter because we can remove a counter for every single 1/1 that attacks us to prevent that damage. This really incentivizes our opponents to attack other players, and we can kind of use this, like I said earlier, to politic our way into a victory. So we have ways that can shut down attacking, but it's all going to be related in some way to tapping. And so those are all of our themes for this week. And the next thing that we're going to do is take a look at some key cards. And these are cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are value pieces or even win conditions all on their own. So the very first card that I want to talk about here is going to be Hilda's Crown of Winter. And this is probably the best card draw card in the entire deck. And it doesn't look like it up front, but this is incredibly powerful in our deck because it is 3 mana for a legendary artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to tap target creature, but this ability costs 1 less to activate during your turn, and you can pay 3 and sacrifice it to draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. So if we have 3 opponents, and each of those opponents controls just 1 tapped creature, this is a little bit expensive, right? 6 mana to draw 3 cards. But if all of our opponents have, say, 5 creatures, and we've now tapped down the entire board, this becomes 6 mana, draw 15 cards, and we can split that 3 mana up over the course of multiple turns. We can wait for the best possible opportunity. So while it doesn't look like much up front, it looks kind of just like any other tap effect. Being able to use the Crown of Winter as a tap effect early on and then card draw effect late in the game really makes it a powerful addition to this deck and a card that you're never sad to see pop up. Moving on though to our second key card, this one is going to be Don't Move. And this is a card that when I was putting this deck together, I ran into it and I realized this is perfect for our deck. This quite literally does everything we want it to be doing. Because Don't Move is 3 white for a sorcery, and it simply says, destroy all tapped creatures, and until your next turn, whenever a creature becomes tapped, destroy it. So if we are loaded up on a ton of tap effects, we are most likely casting this on our turn before we've attacked, meaning none of our creatures are tapped, and then it's destroying anything that is already tapped, and with all of our effects like Timin, Hilda's Crown of Winter, and other effects, we can then just tap any of our opponent's creatures at any point until our next turn, and then it immediately gets destroyed. That means we are guaranteed 1 turn of protection, nobody can attack unless they have vigilance, and it puts us in a situation where we can kind of threaten our opponents with Timin or some of our other tap effects, because if they're not doing what we want them to do, then we can just remove their creatures pretty much at any time. So that is a very powerful effect, and it really is an MVP of the deck. Moving on, though, to our final key card. This one is going to be Willbreaker. Normally, a lot of tap effects are going to be targeting creatures on the board. Willbreaker is going to allow us to not just target them and tap them, but gain control of them. Because Willbreaker is 3 blue for a 2/3 human wizard, whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes the target of a spell or ability you control, gain control of that creature for as long as you control Willbreaker. Being able to turn our Timins and our Hilda's Crown of Winter or any of our other tap effects into what is essentially a permanent gain control of another creature is very, very powerful. We can then take people's commanders, we can take their combo pieces, we can take even things like mana dorks if they're running low on mana, and this really becomes almost backbreaking to certain decks at the table, because there's definitely going to be decks that rely on one or two specific creatures. Maybe they're Voltron style, maybe their commander is just a value piece that they need, and if we can take it away, a lot of their game plan disappears. So Willbreaker becomes very important and very powerful, especially because we are loaded with target effects, and they're very cheap target effects. We can very easily cast 2, 3, 4 of them in a single turn and just take almost all of the board. So I think for those reasons, Willbreaker definitely deserves to be a key card and one of our MVPs of the deck. But without talking too much about it, those are all of our key cards for this week, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases are just fun cards that I wanted to highlight. So the first pair of cards we're going to talk about is going to be Illithid Harvester and Thought Weft Gambit. Illithid Harvester is 4 and a blue for a 4/4 horror. It has Ceramorphosis, so when it enters the battlefield, turn any number of target tapped non-token creatures face down. They're 2/2 horror creatures. And then it also has an adventure sorcery as Plant Tadpoles for X blue. Tap X target creatures. They don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. That is, on its face, pretty solid. It lets us tap things. It lets us flip face down the tapped creatures, turn them into 2/2s. This is another way that we can remove people's commanders or value pieces or anything like that. But where it really gets powerful is when we combine it with one of the few instant speed tap effects in Thought Weft Gambit, which is 2 and a hybrid white-blue for an instant that says tap all creatures your opponents control and untap all creatures you control. So if we can cast Thought Weft Gambit at the end of our opponent's turn, we tap all of our opponent's creatures, we untap, we cast the Illithid Harvester, we turn every single creature that our opponents control into a 2/2 horror. That means they no longer have any of their abilities, they no longer are larger if they were larger than a 2/2, unless of course they have counters, but that's neither here nor there. And this puts us in a massively powerful position with our board, because even just with the Illithid Harvester in play, that's a 4/4. That is something that can't be stopped or possibly can't not stop our opponent's creatures coming at us, and that's just if we have nothing else. Plus, I imagine we have more tap synergies, we maybe have our commanders, we have some card draw effects going. This is a great way for us to kind of wipe the board without actually destroying all of the creatures, which I think is a very unique aspect to this deck. Moving on though, we're going to get to our second cool interaction, and this one is going to be between Solitary Sanctuary and Topplegeist. Solitary Sanctuary, one of our better payoffs for tapping our opponent's creatures. It is 2 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Then, whenever you tap an untapped creature that an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And so if we are tapping at least one creature every single turn, we are putting 4 +1/+1 counters spread among our creatures every single turn around the table. But how do we make sure that we are tapping one creature every single turn? Obviously, we have Hilda's Crown of Winter to tap things, we have Don't Move to tap things, we have a bunch of other stuff. Even our commander Timin can do it. But the real trick here is to use Topplegeist, because Topplegeist is 1 mana for a 1/1 spirit. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls, but more importantly, it has Delirium. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, tap target creature that player controls. We're not a Delirium deck, but it's not very difficult to get Delirium with enchantments, instant sorceries, creatures, artifacts, lands even. So there's plenty of ways that we can do that just naturally. And then Geist itself is a 1 mana, 1/1 flyer, which is the perfect creature to start throwing our +1/+1 counters on from Solitary Sanctuary. So if we cast it, maybe a little bit later in the game where we already have the Sanctuary in play, we have the Geist come in, it taps something, it gets a counter, and then we go around the table and we tap something on each other player's upkeep. That means that when it gets back to us, it will have had 4 counters put on it, and it's now a 5/5 flyer that can start attacking. And that is just with Geist. If we have other ways to tap other creatures or maybe anything else that benefits us, we can make a massive army almost out of nowhere. So that is why I think both of these cards are very important for the deck, and why I think they work so well together. However, that does bring us to the end of our cool interactions, so the next piece of this deck tech is to talk about the price of the deck. And this week, the total deck price came out to $70.02, with the most expensive card in the deck being Charismatic Conqueror at a massive $12.39. And I really tried to fit this card into the deck, and I was worried I wasn't going to, but we're lucky that a lot of tap effects and tap rewards are very, very cheap. So that means we were able to fit the Conqueror in here, and I genuinely do think that it is probably the best card in the deck. Charismatic Conqueror is 1 and a white for a 2/2 vampire soldier. It has vigilance, and whenever an artifact or creature enters the battlefield untapped and under an opponent's control, they may tap that permanent. If they don't, you create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So this gives our opponents the choice to tap their own things when they come in, meaning we don't even have to tap them. We can just let it happen. They tap them. We don't have to worry about it. And if they choose not to tap it, then we can make a 1/1 token, and then we can probably just tap their stuff down anyway. So this is almost like an army in a can kind of a card, where if our opponents are playing enough creatures or enough artifacts, we can very easily untap with a massive army. And it is worth noting that it doesn't specify non-token artifact or creature. So if our opponents make a ton of treasures or a ton of human soldier tokens, that still triggers the Conqueror. We still get the vampires, or they have to come into the play untapped. So I think Charismatic Conqueror, kind of an all-star in the deck, and it's definitely one of those cards to watch out for, because if your opponents aren't paying attention, you can get out of hand very, very quickly. With that being said, it is $12.39, so if you did need to trim down the price of the deck, you can trim it to about $58 just by cutting this one card, so that does make the price a little bit more manageable if that's something you're interested in doing. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well, because the card I would put into this deck if we had an unlimited budget would be Righteous Fury. And this is a card that, if we're being perfectly honest, I don't think it is worth the $25 price tag that it has. And that's really only because it was only printed in, I believe it was the Portals 3 Kingdom set, so it is obviously a little bit rare out there. But it is 4 white for a sorcery, and it says destroy all tapped creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, you gain 2 life. Once again, this is kind of just what we want to be doing in our deck. Being able to destroy all tapped creatures means we can control the board state pretty effectively at any given moment. And then the life gain on it is not actually that unimportant. Being able to gain the life back because our opponents want to be hitting us because we keep tapping and maybe destroying their creatures is going to keep us alive in most games. Now, with that being said, if you are putting a card into the deck, you would obviously have to take a card out of the deck, and my suggestion for you there is Monstrosity of the Lake, and that is 4 and a blue for a 4/6 Kraken. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 5. If you do, tap all creatures your opponents control, then put a stun counter on each of those creatures. And it also has Island Cycling for 2. So if we're being perfectly honest, this is a fine card, but it's just a 5 mana 4/6. The only way we get a 5 mana 4/6 that also taps all of our opponent's creatures is if we pay 10 total mana. And If we're paying 10 mana, then hopefully we're winning the game on that turn because our opponents will be very angry with us. But it's also one of those cards that I don't foresee us actually using very often. I imagine most of the times in this deck, you probably just want to island cycle it to make sure you hit your land drops. And if that's why we have the card in here, then we can probably find something better. So that would be my suggestion for an out-of-budget upgrade and the replacement. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If either of these cards may be better than the other, I would love to hear opinions. And if there's any cards I might have missed, please do let me know that as well. However, that brings us to the end of our deck tech for today. And the last thing I want to do before we jump into a game and see how this deck performs is to thank all of our patrons and our channel members for all of their support so far. If you are not a patron or channel member, I certainly appreciate your support as well. And you can always support the channel by just liking this video and subscribing to the channel. That really does help out a lot. But if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. You can find us here on YouTube as a channel member with the link in the description. And you can also use our discount codes with Shipping Shield, and we'll get a little bit of kickback there, and you'll get an amazing product. So with that being said, let me very quickly say a huge thank you to all of our patrons and channel members. So a thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Huey, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, and the Oak Monster. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And if you would like to join that amazing group of people, like I said, please do check us out. But with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our opponents for this game that we're going to play and see how our deck can perform. So this week, we are being joined by Doodle, playing Dong Zhao the Tyrant, Bilal playing Corvold the Fey Cursed King, and Vintage playing Ayara First of Loch Thwain. So Dong Zhao is a deck that we've seen on the channel multiple times. Doodle is still trying to get his first win with it. He usually comes very, very close to winning, and I can kind of see why. Dong Zhao is a very powerful deck, and it really puts in a lot of work with mono red clones, being able to make copies of his commander and deal a ton of damage to his opponents based on the size of his opponent's creatures. And I have died to this commander many times. I have no doubt that at some point it will get a win. It definitely deserves it. So I think I am definitely concerned about this deck going into this because, you know, one of our commanders, Rhoda, can get very large very quickly, and then Dong Zhao can just kill us with our own commander. So we'll see how this one goes. Moving on to Bilal's Corvold deck. This is easily the deck that I'm the most concerned about going into this. Corvold is amazingly powerful, and this is a very well-tuned Corvold list from Bilal. So I have no doubt that there are plenty of infinite combos, there's plenty of value pieces and sacrifice synergies, and I've played against Corvold enough times to know that is priority target number one. Corvold is always a problem, so this is probably the deck that I am gunning for the hardest. And then last but not least, we have Vintage and his Ayara deck. This is, again, another deck that has showed up on the channel a couple of times. This is one of his more recent decks. It's kind of a mono-black value deck, but it also has some neat token and sacrifice synergies to play into Ayara and her abilities. But it's always kind of cool to see some of the things that Vintage can bring to the table. He's very open about he only builds decks using cards in his collection, which I think is a super cool restriction to use. And it's definitely one that reminds me a lot of when I first started playing and why I really love Magic. And so it's very cool to see him break out these decks and kind of get to learn what some of the cards do. And even though he might play cards I've never heard of, they're always very powerful and always put in a ton of work. So let's see how this game goes. Hopefully our tapping shenanigans can keep up with the rest of what's going on. But as always, please do let me know down in the comments any predictions you have for the game. Let me know who you think is going to walk out the winner. And as always, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel. But let's get it into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Bilal, Vintage, and then myself. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Desert of the Fervent. Bilal plays a Copperline Gorge and cast Witch's Cauldron, which can tap to sacrifice a creature and make a food token, or make 2 food tokens if the sacrificed creature has 4 power or greater. Vintage plays a Swamp. I play a Plains. Doodle plays a command beacon and casts Reckless Handling, searching his library for an artifact, specifically Soul Ring, putting it into his hand and then discarding a card at random. This has him discarding the Soul Ring and doing 2 damage to each opponent since he discarded an artifact. Bilal plays a mountain. Vintage plays a swamp and casts Dreg Recycler, which can tap to sacrifice an artifact or creature, letting Vintage gain a life and making each of his opponents lose a life. I play a plains. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Blade of Selves. Bilal plays a forest, then casts Farhaven Elf, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Vintage plays a swamp and casts his commander, Ayara, First of Loch Thwain, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever it or another black creature enters under his control. He then moves to combat and attacks Doodle for 2 with the Recycler. On my turn, I cast a Knight of the White Orchid, searching my library for a plains and putting it into play. Then I play a Scavenger Grounds and pass. Doodle plays a mountain. Bilal plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then he casts Knight's Whisper, paying 2 life to draw 2 cards. Vintage plays a swamp and casts Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant, amassing Orcs 1 when it enters, giving his creature tokens Death Touch, gaining 2 life, making each opponent lose 2 life, and then he moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 2. On my turn, I play a plains and cast my commander, Rhoda, Geist Avenger, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature becomes tapped but isn't being declared as an attacker. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Rionia Fire Dancer, letting him make X+1 token copies of target creature he controls when he moves to combat, giving them haste and sacrificing them at the end of turn, where X is the number of instants and sorceries he's cast this turn. Bilal cast his commander, Korvold, Fey-Cursed King, making him sacrifice a permanent when he enters or attacks, then also letting Bilal draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold whenever he sacrifices a permanent. This has him sacrifice Farhaven Elf, then he plays a Fabled Passage, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play, meaning Korvold gets 2 total counters and Bilal draws 2. At the end of turn, Vintage activates Ayara, tapping her and sacrificing his army to draw a card, also putting a counter on Rhoda. Then on Vintage's turn, he plays a Memorial to Folly and casts Kaya's Ghost Form, enchanting Gothmog, so if it leaves the battlefield, it'll return to play instead. Then he casts Feast on the Fallen, putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature he controls in each upkeep, as long as an opponent lost life last turn. After that, he moves to combat, attacking me for 3 with Gothmog, but I block with my commander, killing it, returning it to play thanks to Kaya's Ghost Form, letting him amass Orcs 1, gain 2 life, and makes each of his opponents lose 2 life. In my upkeep, Vintage puts a +1/+1 counter on Ayara with Feast of the Fallen, then I play a Plains and cast Ghostly Prison, making each opponent pay 2 mana to attack me, and I move to combat, attacking Doodle for 4 with Rhoda. Doodle plays a Dwarven Mine, making a 1/1 dwarf token, then casts his commander Dong Zhao the Tyrant, making a creature do damage to its controller equal to its power, this time having Korvold do 6 damage to Bilal. Then he moves to combat, triggering Rionia, making a token copy of Dong Zhao, which immediately dies to the legend rule, but does still have Korvold do another 6 damage to Bilal. On Bilal's turn, he plays an Overgrown Tomb tapped, then casts Blood Artist, gaining a life and making target opponent lose a life whenever a creature dies. Then he also casts Wishclaw Talisman, which enters with 3 wish counters, and can be tapped to remove a counter, let its controller search their library for a card, and give control of the talisman to target opponent. After that, he attacks Vintage with Korvold for 6, targeting the Wishclaw Talisman with Korvold's ability, but before it can resolve, he activates the talisman to search his library for a card, put it into his hand, and passes the talisman to Doodle. At the end of turn, Vintage activates Ayara to sacrifice his Orc army, draw a card, and put a counter on my commander. Then, on Vintage's turn, he cast Maha its Feathers Knight, making all his opponent's creatures have a base toughness of 1. This also triggers Ayara, so Vintage gains a life and his opponents lose a life. Then he attacks Bilal for 2. In my upkeep, Vintage puts a counter on Maha, and I cast Solitary Sanctuary, tapping Maha when it enters, discarding a card to pay for ward, putting a stun counter on it, and now putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature I control whenever I tap an opponent's creature, meaning I put 2 counters on Rhoda for tapping Maha. This lets me attack Vintage for 7 with my commander, but he blocks with Gothmog, sacrificing it with Ayara before damage to draw a card, putting another counter on Rhoda, but he takes no combat damage. Doodle plays a mountain and activates Wishclaw Talisman, giving control of it to Vintage and searching his library for a card, putting it into his hand. Once that resolves, he equips Dong Zhao with Blade of Selves, giving his commander Myriad. Moving to combat, Rionya creates a token copy of Dong Zhao, dying when it enters, but still having Corvold deal 7 damage to Bilal, or at least it would have, if Bilal hadn't sacrificed his commander with Witch's Oven, making 2 food tokens. This also triggers Blood Artist twice, making me lose 2 life while Bilal gains 2. Once that resolves, Doodle attacks Bilal for 3 with Rionya and attacks Vintage for 3 with Dong Zhao, creating 2 token copies of it that are attacking Bilal and myself, but they both get sacrificed immediately thanks to the legend rule, making Vintage lose 2 while Bilal gains 2. However, both Dong Zhao still trigger, making Rhoda do 8 damage to me twice. Bilal plays a forest and casts Cauldron Familiar, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life when it enters. Then he also casts Nantuko Husk, which can sacrifice a creature to give itself +2/+2 until the end of turn. He immediately sacrifices the Cauldron Familiar, making Doodle lose a life while he gains a life, then activates the Familiar's ability, sacrificing a food to return it to play, again gaining a life and making each of his opponents lose a life. At this point, we also remember that Vintage should have put a counter on a creature in Bilal's upkeep, so he puts another counter on Ayara. Bilal then repeats this process with Cauldron Familiar, sacrificing it again, but when he sacrifices his last food token to return the Familiar to play, I activate Scavenger Grounds with it on the stack, exiling each player's graveyard and permanently getting rid of the cat. In Vintage's upkeep, he puts another counter on Ayara, then plays an Emergence Zone and activates Wishclaw Talisman, removing the final counter from it, giving control of it to Doodle, and searching his library for a card, putting it into his hand. This lets him cast the thing he tutored for, a Grey Merchant of Asphodel, but in response, Doodle casts Tybalt's Trickery, countering the spell, making Vintage mill 2, then he reveals cards from his library until he reveals a non-land, casting it for free, which lets him cast Heraldic Banner, naming black when it enters to give his black creatures +1/+0. Once all of that resolves, Vintage attacks Doodle for 9 with his entire board. In my upkeep, Vintage puts a +1/+1 counter on Dreg Recycler, and I cast Angel's Trumpet, giving all creatures vigilance, and at the end of each player's turn, tapping all untapped creatures they control that did not attack that turn, doing 1 damage to their controller for each creature tapped this way. Since my creatures now both have vigilance, I attack Vintage with them for 10. Doodle casts Fury, doing 4 damage divided as he chooses among any number of target creatures, doing 1 to Blood Artist and 3 to Nantuko Husk, killing them both, making Doodle lose 2 life while Bilal gains 2. Before the ability fully resolves though, Bilal does sacrifice the Nantuko with Witch's Oven to create a food token. Once that resolves, Doodle casts Twin Flame, making a token copy of Fury, and when the token enters, it deals 3 to Dreg Recycler and 1 to Knight of the White Orchid, killing them both. Then, when Doodle moves to combat, Rionya triggers, making 2 copies of Dong Zhao, both of which immediately die, but they still have Ayara and Maha do damage to him equal to their power, discarding a card for ward, making Vintage take a total of 14 damage. Finally, Doodle attacks Bilal with his entire board for 13, making 2 more copies of his commander, which immediately die, but still have Ayara do 6 damage to Vintage, knocking him out of the game, and has Rhoda do 8 damage to me. On Bilal's turn, he casts Burnished Heart and casts Braid's Arisen Nightmare, then plays a Game Trail, When he moves to his end step, Braids triggers, letting Bilal sacrifice the game trail, making each opponent also sacrifice a land. Also at the end of turn, Angel's Trumpet taps Bilal's creatures and has him take 2 damage and put 4 counters on Rhoda. On my turn, I play an island, finally having access to blue mana and letting me cast my other commander, Timin, Youthful Geist. This allows me to tap a creature at the beginning of combat on each turn, so when I move to combat, I tap Dong Zhao, putting 2 more counters on Rhoda, letting me attack Doodle for 15, but he blocks with his dwarf token, killing it and taking no damage. Finally, at the end of turn, I have to tap Timin and take a damage myself. Doodle moves straight to combat on his turn, so I tap his commander, while Rionya makes a token copy of it. This time he chooses to sacrifice the non-token copy of Dong Zhao to the legend rule, but still has Rhoda do 15 damage to me, knocking me out of the game. Then he attacks Bilal with his entire board for 9 damage, putting him down to only 4 life. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Magus of the Wheel, and also casts a Crawl Space, making it so that no more than 2 creatures can attack him each combat. On Bilal's turn, he casts a Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature he controls dies. He also casts Pitiless Plunderer, letting him make a treasure token whenever a creature he controls dies, and once that's resolved, he uses Witch's Oven to sacrifice Burnished Heart, making both a food and a treasure token, while also gaining a life and making Doodle lose a life. After that, he casts Chatterfang, which makes a 1/1 squirrel token whenever he would make another token. Finally, he moves to his end step, sacrificing Braids to her own trigger, and this sets off a chain reaction, letting Bilal create a treasure and a squirrel token. With that, he's able to use the treasure to activate Chatterfang, sacrificing the squirrel to give target creature +1/-1, and more importantly, this lets him make another treasure and another squirrel, allowing him to repeat this process an infinite number of times, also making Doodle lose a life each time thanks to the Zulaport Cutthroat, knocking him out, and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We really got unlucky as the game went on because you may have noticed we didn't find blue mana until our very last turn of the game. But even without blue mana, we still managed to hold our own. We were still tapping quite a few things. We had a massive commander, we had protection with Ghostly Prison, and it was nice to see that the deck could still function even without access to half of our colors. And I think that's a very good mark for the deck. And I think that really goes to show that if we had access to blue, there's a very good chance we could have won that game pretty handily, considering how well we managed to stay in it, even without that color. Moving on around the rest of the table, we have Doodle and his Dong Zhao deck. He got so incredibly close to winning the game this time, and I genuinely believe that if Bilal had been even just a single mana short, he would not have been able to infinitely combo out on his final turn, and therefore Doodle would have just untapped and beat him with the rest of his deck. So I think that that is something to be aware of. I think Dong Zhao is incredibly powerful, and even though it doesn't get a ton of wins on the channel, that doesn't mean that it's not the player in the game. It's definitely the deck that the rest of the game warps around, because you really have to watch out for dying to your own cards at any given time, and I think that's a super cool build around. Next up, we've got Bilal, who did wind up winning, did very well throughout the course of the game. He struggled to get some synergies going early on. Being able to keep Korvold on the table would have definitely done him a pretty big service. But I think by the end of it, no one at the table really expected him to win. He kind of dropped an infinite combo out of nowhere, which is very like Bilal. He tends to lean heavily toward infinite combos, which is certainly not a bad thing. Everyone has their own play style. But I think it's one of those things where we probably should have focused a little bit more on Korvold when the game started, and we kind of let him get away with things, especially after his commander died. And I think that played pretty heavily into how the game ended. And then, last but not least, we have Vintage. And his deck also did very well. He was one that I know Doodle was afraid of going into this because he really wasn't playing a ton of big creatures. He just wanted to sacrifice things and drain people. And I think that if he'd had his Grey Merchant resolve, I genuinely think that Vintage would have been the winner of this game. So there were quite a few turns where just a simple change in what had happened, or maybe someone didn't have interaction, could have changed the entire course of the game. And I think those are always the best games to play, because it means that the decisions that you're making in a game actually matter. It doesn't feel like you just got rolled over by your opponents. So I hope you all enjoyed the game. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Please do let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos or future cards to build around. As always, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.